Okay, Jeremiah chapter 4. Now, something that kind of what I do this morning with this little passage is just kind of give you a way to read the Bible, right? A way to kind of be thinking about the Bible as you read it on your own, as you study it, as you read it for your quiet times, for devotions, for any reason, as you come to the Bible, especially the Old Testament. How do you approach it? What are the questions you have in your mind? You can come to the text with all sorts of questions. You can ask, what does this say about God? That's a good question, isn't it? And then you can sort of extract the implications from the text about who God is, what he's done, and then you can sort of put that together to almost form like a systematic theology, a doctrine about God. Who is God? That's a good way to approach the text. You can ask, what does it tell me about me? What does it tell you about people, humans? You can kind of get an anthropology from texts. What does it tell us about our sinfulness, our fallenness, our inability to understand God? You can ask that sort of question. You can ask the question of what does it tell me to do? Ethics. You can get ethics from the Bible. And we're going to hear a lot of that today, are we?
Probably.
Yeah, there we go. We're going to hear some ethics from Romans. That's another good question. You can also just ask the simple question, what would this have meant to the first readers? What did the author intend people to understand? And then what would people have understood as they read Jeremiah in the late 7th and 6th centuries? What that would be to kind of do historical criticism on the Bible. That's another valid question. How I want to look at the Bible today is to ask the question, what themes emerge? And then try and trace some of those themes in the Bible, backwards and forwards, so kind of in the entirety of the Bible. And then hopefully that will place the text in the kind of overall scheme of redemptive history and point to Christ. So it's kind of like another way of asking the question, where is Jesus in this? Where is Christ in this passage? So that's kind of, I want to give you an example of how one can do that. That might be helpful as you read the Bible for yourselves. You can ask me more questions about that if it's not been made clear by the end. So Jeremiah chapter 4, just to give you the barest bit of background to kind of put this chapter in context. Jeremiah is obviously one of the kind of major prophets. You all know that. And he was preaching and teaching and prophesying, like I said, at the end of the 7th century and the beginning of the 6th century, during the reigns of 4 or 5 kings or so, Josiah, or 3 kings rather, Josiah, Jehoiakim, Zedekiah. And those are the last few kings before Judah is captured by the Babylonians, captured by Babylon, the Babylonians. And obviously this is a pretty bad time in the nation's history. He's prophesying judgment, he's prophesying destruction during the reigns of those kings, and he's largely rejected, he's largely ignored, he's largely given opposition in response to his message, which is mainly one of judgment. There is 3 chapters of real hope in the midst of that. Chapters 30 to 33 of Jeremiah are some of the most glorious messages in the whole of the Old Testament, really, of hope, of the new covenant. That's where we get some of that new covenant language, that God would redeem his people and give them a new covenant and put a heart of flesh in them and put his spirit amongst them and all those sorts of things. That's kind of in the midst of the judgment. But we are knee-deep in the judgment at this point, chapter 4, okay? Because chapter 1 is Jeremiah is called. He's called by God, and you will probably remember some of the language that God uses when he calls him, like famous verses like, I formed you when you were in your mother's womb. You know, he's chosen even before he was born, sort of idea, to go and preach to God's people. But in that call, in chapter 1, he is given the image of a boiling pot of judgment from the north. That's like a vision that Jeremiah is given. And God says that in verse 16 of chapter 1, I'll declare my judgments against them, that is Judah, for all their evil in forsaking me. So this pot of judgment is going to spill over the land, as it were, and that's kind of symbolic of the armies that are going to invade the land. Chapter 2, he gives a kind of case for why this is happening, and God says through Jeremiah, what wrong did your fathers find in me that they went far from me? What wrong did your fathers find in me that they went far from me? And God is saying, I've been good to you, I've been faithful to me, and you have consistently and continually rejected me and turned from me and gone after idols. But why? Why did you do this? You have no one to blame but yourselves when the judgment comes, almost. Chapter 3, the case is mounted even further, and Jeremiah compares Judah to an adulterous wife or to a whore, which you see many times in Scripture. That's a kind of a dominant image in Ezekiel and Hosea. Other prophets said similar things. They have gone after different gods. They should have been faithful, like a wife is faithful to her husband, in the covenant that God had given them, but they broke covenant. They chased after other gods. That's Jeremiah and God's accusation against Judah in chapter 3. And then as we come into chapter 4, we see that the result of all this unfaithfulness, the charges that Jeremiah brings against them, is there's going to be a judgment. And that judgment is kind of cast in a language of the day of the Lord's visitation, the day that the Lord will come to his people, but not come in a good way, come in a terrifying way, come as an enemy, and an enemy will surround them and take over them and destroy them, and that will be God acting through Israel's and Judah's enemies. Right? He is sovereign over the situation, so he's using this foreign power, Babylon, to enact his sovereign will over Israel and Judah as they are judged, or Judah is judged, Jerusalem is judged. So our passage is right smack dab in the middle of that, and we're going to see kind of what is this day of the Lord going to be like? What is it going to be like when God brings judgment on his people? So let's have a look. Verse 23 down to verse 26 reads this way. I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light. I looked on the mountains, and behold, they were quaking, and all the hills moved to and fro. I looked, and behold, there was no man, and all the birds of the air had fled. I looked, and behold, the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins before the Lord, before his fierce anger. I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light. All right, so there's the beginning of the kind of the grim picture of what God's judgment is like on his people. And you could probably picked up straight away almost that this is de-creation language, right? The earth is, if you like, going back to what it was like before creation. Look at verse 23. I looked at the earth, and behold, it was without form, void, and to the heavens, and they had no light, like the world before it was, or before the universe was created, without form and void. In Genesis 1, he's picking up on that language there, and the darkness as well. There's no light. This is the deep significance of God's judgment. It takes apart that which exists and de-creates it, if you like. Because if you think, going back to Genesis 1, creation is described as God forming things. To create something is to form it in some senses. God formed the earth, forms the dry land, forms the animals, forms the plants, forms man, right? And then in that kind of language is used throughout the Old Testament in other contexts too, like in Psalm 139:13 is a famous verse that said, David saying, "You formed my innermost parts," right? So to bring something into being, to form is to bring something into being, to give it life, to give it purpose. And you see this in the fact that Isaiah says that God formed a people for himself. That's what his covenant people are, Israel, Judah at this point. They are people formed to exist for God and his glory. So when Jeremiah says the earth was without form, it is to say that it's been deconstructed, it's been unmade. The kind of purpose and reason for existence and its life has been kind of taken away and removed, and it is undergoing painful destruction, if you like. And then kind of thrown into that mix is not just the deforming of the earth, but also the removal of the light as well, symbolizing that this is a cosmic event. In some senses, light was the first element of creation, wasn't it? God separated the light from the darkness. And then as the heavenly bodies are made to emit their light, to govern the light and the night and the day, They are said to declare the glory of God by the psalmist, aren't they? So to remove the light is in some senses to remove God's glory, because you see the light is used in the Levitical cult with the Levites. They have that lamp that's burning for always before the presence of the Lord in the holy place. The holy place itself, or the Holy of Holies, is gold. It kind of shining with the light of God's presence. And that presence is symbolized in fire as well in the tabernacle and in the temple. The fire of God's presence, light, it emits light, right? And that's being removed. Jeremiah is saying, you're being decreated. God's presence is being removed from you. That is the punishment. So you're losing the light of all of the light of creation symbolizes and represents. That is the judgment that Israel, I keep saying Israel, Judah is undergoing. Look at verse 24. He then goes on, I looked on the mountains, and behold, they were quaking, and all the hills moved to and fro. Mountains, the most stable thing on earth, right? Mountains symbolize stability, strength. But you don't have to be a Bible scholar to know that mountains turn up a lot in the Old Testament, right? Things are always happening on mountains. You could sort of deduce that perhaps Eden is supposed to be conceived as a mountain because it has the head springs of 4 rivers, and rivers tend to start on high ground, don't they? Eden, in some sense, is depicted as a mountain, the place where God can dwell. Mountains have that kind of imagery throughout the Old Testament. Mountains, you see them they kind of turn up when Moses, gets the law on top of a mountain. That's significant. Elijah meets God on the top of a mountain, Mount Carmel. And then God refers to Jerusalem as the Mount Zion, right? Even though it's not really that much of a mountain, like geographically speaking. Symbolically speaking, it is, because it's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God dwells with his people. That's what it is to talk about mountains oftentimes. That's why the transfiguration happens on top of a mountain. The ascension happens on top of a mountain. They're very significant places in the Bible. But here Jeremiah is saying mountains, i.e. the place where God almost meets earth, heaven and earth meet. What's happening to it? They're quaking. The mountains cannot withstand the day of the Lord, if you like. And then we see that kind of imagery played out all the way through into the New Testament with the quaking earth, the earth itself kind of shaking in fear, if you like. When Jesus dies, there was an earthquake, right? Like the earth is telling us, almost symbolically showing the magnitude of what Jesus was undergoing. When judgment comes, the mountains quake, right? When judgment fell upon Christ and he took that, the earth shook. It was a cosmic event, if you like. Verse 25, it continues. I looked, and behold, there was no man, and all the birds of the air had fled. What does he mean when he says, I looked, and behold, there was no man? Just that everyone had died in the judgment? Potentially, but there's more to it than that. Man is obviously made in the image of God, right? And the whole reason for man's existence is that they would spread that image across the earth, that they would take the image from the Garden of Eden and spread out, and therefore fill the earth with God's glory, fill the earth with the image of God. The very kind of existence of people in the earth is a testament to God's glory, right? And as we flourish, human life flourishes, and civilization develops, and cultivation happens, and all those sorts of things. That is what we were supposed to do, and it should culminate in worship. That's like man's role on the earth. But here, when Jeremiah looks in this kind of picture he's given, he sees there was no man. Or you can even think of it as God looking on the earth. There is no man. No man, no image of God, no glory there. The judgment meant that not just that no man was left kind of standing alive, but rather no man could stand before the judgment. There was no man who could take that judgment, no man that could receive that judgment. They've all kind of fled, right, before the Lord. Just like the birds of the air have fled, you could kind of the coupling of the poetry. The men have fled. They couldn't stand before the judgment of the Lord. But take it to the New Testament and think about how this theme is played out, right? The disciples all fled, right? The disciples all were fleeing, but there was one man. There was a man. There was one man who could stand in the judgment of God, who could receive the judgment of God. That's why I think one of the best verses, the richest, shortest verses in the Bible is when Pilate says, "Behold the man." He's saying, behold the true image of God. Behold the man who has come and will do everything that humanity was supposed to do, right? He images God's glory perfectly. He is fruitful and multiplies and fills the earth and subdues it and tends it and rules over it. This is the man. He can stand in the judgment. So it's almost as if in Jeremiah, God looks and there's no one. But then when Christ comes and takes the proper, full fulfillment of the judgment in which is symbolized in verse 25, he looks and behold, there was a man. That's like the whole good news of the gospel, is that there was a man, Jesus, who could take that judgment for us. Continue on, verse 26. I looked, and behold, the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins before the Lord, before his fierce anger. Now, fruitfulness is a nice, easy theme to trace in the Bible, isn't it? The Bible begins with fruitfulness. Fruits are all over the place in the Garden of Eden. It's filled with fruit. The people are placed in the garden with this fruit, which is a sign of God's abundant goodness, a symbol of his blessing, his kind of lavish graciousness that he gives to his people. It's all full of fruit, and they're supposed to go out and kind of continue that, right? Cultivate the earth, continue being fruitful, multiplying. That was their role, and that was the sign of God's blessing as they did that. But obviously with the fall, what happens is that the earth becomes unfruitful, right? It becomes barren. It becomes hard to get things to grow. And by the sweat of your brow you will bring forth your bread, is what the curse is. And so we see that when God calls his people, in Deuteronomy 32:10, he says, God says that I found you in a desert land, in the howling waste of the wilderness. And he says God had encircled his people, cared for them, and he kept them as the apple of his eye, right? God had saved his people from the wilderness and given them fruitfulness again. As they kind of march through the desert, he provides for them, right? And even the kind of center of their religious life, the tabernacle, is full of imagery of fruits and things, pomegranates and things, that like some of the artistic designs in there. Fruitfulness. To be in God's presence is to be fruitful. And he promised that after he took them through the wilderness, that they would go into the land, the promised land. And the characteristic of the promised land is that it's filled flowing with milk and honey. And when they send their spies in, they come back with giant bunches of grapes. Fruitful, right? It's fruitful. And then when God promises, if you keep my covenant, you will receive the blessings. And what are the blessings? They're symbolized with fruitfulness. Every man will have a vine. Everyone will have their fig tree. Everyone will have fruitful land, right? That's the kind of symbolic of the blessings of the covenant. So the opposite of that, fruitfulness, the curse is for the disobedience of the covenant, is unfruitfulness. Barrenness, a wasteland, desert. And that's what Jeremiah is saying. I looked, behold, the fruitful land, the land that was supposed to be blossoming with the riches of God's grace, has turned into a desert. There's nothing left. They're undergoing covenant curses. It's become, as Isaiah says, a dry land, a wilderness and a dry land it's become. But Isaiah, in a similar sort of language that we see here in Jeremiah, doesn't leave it there. He says that there's as much as it is a dry land, this desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. And we see that kind of play out in the New Testament, right? Because Jeremiah is saying, you're going to be judged, the fruitfulness is going to be a desert. You would think that Israel would try to become fruitful again, as it were, but they don't. They never really quite manage it. And that's why when John the Baptist comes, chapter 3 of Matthew, he says, bear fruit in keeping with repentance. Any branch that doesn't bear fruit will be cut off and thrown into the fire. And Jesus later on, when he curses the fig tree, kind of gives us a picture lesson of the fact that Israel was not bearing fruit. They were not being a fruitful people. They had become and continued to be a dry and desert land, as it were. But again, the good news is that Israel couldn't be fruitful. Jesus says, I am the true vine, right? He is the vine. Whoever abides in me will bear fruit. That's how the fruitfulness can start again. How does this desert wasteland turn into a fruitful garden again? By the planting of the true vine, the one that bears fruit. And as we are in him, we bear fruit, right? And you see that in the Great Commission. Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations to his people, to the people that will abide in him, which is basically to kind of recast the command that Adam and Eve were given. Go and multiply and fill the earth, subdue it, take God's image around the earth. As we are recreated in Christ's image, we are therefore sent out to make disciples, to also graft people into that vine, to use that metaphor, and then bear fruit, right? The fruits of the Spirit, the fruits bear fruit in keeping with repentance. So the desert can become a fruitful land once again. But as Jeremiah is looking on, he's seeing the judgment. He's seeing the fruitful land becoming a desert before the Lord and before his fierce anger. And then he goes on to say, verse 27, for thus says the Lord, the whole land shall be a desolation, yet I will not make a full end. So here I think Jeremiah is saying that even though there's going to be judgment, and it's going to be cosmic, it's going to be epic, it's going to be more than you can really comprehend at this point, it's going to be terrible, I will not yet make a full end. There's going to be a glimmer of hope. There's always some grace there wrapped up in the judgment. This isn't the final judgment, he's saying. This is only symbolic of, only points towards the final judgment that will come, obviously, at the end of time. So there's a remnant kept when he says, yet I will not make a full end. That's kind of that similar sort of idea, as there will always be a remnant, always a remainder upon which God shows grace and mercy. And you see that all throughout the prophets. They're always talking about, even though there's going to be judgment, even though that we're going to be judged and taken into exile, there will be a remnant. A remnant will return and continue the work of the Lord. And they are to come back from exile, which, symbolically, exile is not just the curse of breaking the covenant, but also symbolic of being under a foreign ruler, under sin, if you like. And we are saved from exile, out of sin, us as a remnant. We are a remnant saved from the world that is under the rule of Satan and sin and death. There's that imagery. But there's also the imagery that Christ himself is the remnant, right? Christ himself is the one that in the midst of judgment, one is saved too, right? He comes through the judgment, the remnant returns. He comes through the exile of death and comes out to therefore kind of bear God's grace again in that fruitfulness and in that multiplying. We are the remnant, Christ is the remnant. It's all kind of intermixed layers of meaning there. Verse 28, for the earth shall mourn and the heavens above be dark, for I have spoken, I have purposed, I have not relented, nor will I turn back. I have to brush over some of these verses a little bit quicker than we've been going. This is a dark, cosmic, epic event. The earth shall mourn, right? All of nature, all of creation recognizes God when he turns up in judgment, if you like. And there's all sorts of mourning throughout the Bible. People are mourning all over the place. And obviously people mourn because of death, don't they? They mourn because of death and loss and judgment and grief and bereavement. People mourn on the judgment of sin and evil. But then, as you get into the New Testament, you see Jesus kind of flips it completely on his head, because some of the most famous verses about mourning come from places like Matthew in the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And in the Upper Room Discourse in the Gospel of John, Jesus famously says to his disciples, "You will weep and lament," i.e., you will mourn, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, you will be mourning, but your sorrow will turn to joy. And when the women when they went to the tomb on that Easter morning, we see what he's talking about, what Jesus is talking about. They went in mourning, right? They went as those that had been recently bereaved. They went as those to anoint a body, those who were confronted with the reality of death. But it was light. Mark says has that little detail. But it was light. They went whilst the sun had just arisen. It was light. And their mourning was turned instantly to joy, wasn't it? As they realized that they were no longer bereaved, that Christ had risen, that their darkness had been dispelled by the power of the light. And so the mourning was turned to joy. But at this point, when Jeremiah is speaking, it's all mourning. It's all mourning. The joy is yet to come. Verse 29, at the noise of horseman and archer, every city takes to flight. They enter thickets. They climb among rocks. All the cities are forsaken, and no man dwells in them. This is classic judgment language here. I don't think we have time to go into every facet of this kind of verse, but again, it's pointing to the final end day of the Lord, right? When Jesus returns in judgment. You hear about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse all the time, don't you? It's like probably the most famous occasion of horsemen in the Bible. But Jesus comes back riding on a horse in the imagery of Revelation. He comes back as a mighty conquering king with a sword in his hand, riding on that white horse, slaying his enemies. So you see that kind of imagery turned from an image of terror, right? The horsemen coming, the powerful conquering ones coming to destroy Jerusalem. Rather, it becomes an image of hope, an image of glory as you move into the New Testament, where the conquering one, when he comes in judgment, is a cause of great celebration for those that are in him, for those that are under his rule, because he's going to slay his enemies. He's going to bring judgment on those that oppose us. He's going to bring judgment on death itself that still harasses us and causes us so much pain. But look, verse 30. Jeremiah continues, and we're trying to try and wrap up in the next few minutes. And you, O desolate one, what do you mean that you dress in scarlet, that you adorn yourself with ornaments of gold, that you enlarge your eyes with paint? In vain you beautify yourself, and your lovers despise you. They seek your life. And like I said earlier, Jerusalem and Israel, the people of Israel, are often compared to an unfaithful wife or a harlot or a prostitute or something like that. And that's what's going on here. She's dressing herself in the accoutrement of a lady of the night. She's dressed in scarlet, right? And that kind of immediately should make you think of other times when that kind of imagery appears in the Bible. Most famously, probably, is the whore of Babylon, right? In Revelation again, riding on the beast, drinking the blood of the martyrs and all those sorts of things that she's up to. It's the same thing. Like Jerusalem, Israel have become evil in as much as they have turned away from the Lord, and they are going after these foreign gods, enticing people to come almost to engage in their rebellion against God. But it's deeply sad and ironic, really, because as much as they try and they go after these foreign nations and they're trying to get help from Egypt and some of their enemies to help them against Babylon. That's kind of the background to what Jeremiah is talking about here. They're going after these foreign nations, putting their trust and their hope in them. As much as they do that, those people, what's their kind of response? The foreign gods, the foreign nations, their response is that they actually despise Judah and God's people, and they seek their life. So Judah thinks, and Jerusalem thinks, that they're going to be saved by these things, that they can put their trust in them, but really that's going to be the cause of their death. And it's so deeply sad and ironic, because that's true of idolatry and sin in all its forms, isn't it, in our life? All the things that we think are going to bring us joy, that we put our trust in, that we turn to and use, end up using us and abusing us and enslaving us and entrapping us. And they look sweet, but they end up being bitter, don't they? Because idols always destroy those that put their trust in them. And this is the result, verse 31. For I heard a cry as a woman in labour, anguish as one giving birth to her first child, the cry of the daughter of Zion, gasping for breath, stretching out her hands. Woe is me, I am fainting before murderers. You see, Israel thought that she was kind of winning over lovers in the last verse 30. She thought that she was attracting people to come to her aid. She had some sort of power in that enticement. But really, what do our lovers do? They leave her bleeding. Right? The scarlet of her clothes, almost to continue that imagery, is replaced now with the scarlet of blood. And she ends up not giving birth to life, as you would expect, but giving birth to the gasping of breath, giving birth to the air, giving birth to death. She's crying out for help. She's gasping for breath. She's stretching out her hands. Obviously, the imagery there is she's kind of stretching out her hands in supplication. But it's almost impossible to see those verses without thinking of hands being stretched out more in this sort of fashion. Because I think this is very much clearly is speaking of Jesus. Jesus cried out as if in anguish, as if in the pain of childbirth, didn't he? When he was on the cross, because it was the cry of the cursed one. Childbirth, now as it is experienced, is part of the curse. So that when Jeremiah talks in here of that using that imagery, he's talking of the nation being cursed in its judgment. All right. So as Jesus received that curse on the cross and that judgment on the cross, it was as if he was gasping for breath, stretching out his hands, fainting before murderers. But his cry was not a vain cry, right? His cry was not a cry of anguish in vain, giving birth to nothing but death, no one to help. His cry of anguish actually gave birth, if you like, if we can use that imagery of Christ, gave birth to new life, to the church, right? As he dies on the cross, his cleansing blood and water that flows from his body is that which sanctifies and redeems for himself a people. Yeah? His death wounds bring us life. So the curse, the judgment, is taken by him and reversed. That death becomes the source of life. And that's where I'd like to end it today, with that thought in our minds of Christ offering us the sanctifying life that can flow from him, that can result in the fruitfulness that we are supposed to have as those created in God's image. So, there we go. There's Jeremiah chapter 4. Any questions or comments?